The debris field had no name on any official chart. The compact called it Sector 7 Gamma Remnant, which was the kind of name given to places where things died, and nobody wanted to think too carefully about what those things were. I had been running salvage routes through unnamed places like this for 6 years. You learn not to ask questions in sectors with no names. You just clip your oxygen line, fire your retrieval magnets, and haul whatever comes loose. My ship was called the Ardent Null. It was not a beautiful ship. It was the kind of vessel that looked, from a distance, like someone had bolted 3 different ships together after an argument. Every panel had a repair history. Every seal had been replaced at least twice. But she flew straight. Her cargo hold was clean, and her reactor had never once surprised me in a way I did not survive. That was enough. My AI was named Drea. She had a voice like someone who had read every book ever written, and found most of them disappointing. I had set her tone to neutral when I bought the ship. She had somehow migrated to something close to dry amusement over the years. I had stopped trying to fix it. Biosignature, she said. I was in the middle of tagging a bent thruster housing from the wreckage when her voice came through my helmet feed. I stopped. Say that again. Biosignature, small, warm, inconsistent with hull material, fuel residue, or any cataloged salvage compound. She paused. It is alive, Marcus. I looked around the debris field. The wreckage was Korvath. That much was obvious. Korvath ships had a particular texture to them, like scales pressed into metal, all curved edges and amber-tinted alloy. This convoy had been large once. Now it was a cloud of broken pieces spinning slowly in the dark. Whatever had hit it hard, and left in a hurry. No survivors had been reported, no distress beacons. The compact had listed it as a closed incident. I followed Drea's bearing marker to a pod wedged between 2 collapsed hull sections. It was small, sealed, designed to survive impact. A diplomatic-grade survival pod, the kind you only found on ships that carried someone important. The exterior was scorched black. One seam was warped from heat exposure. I had to use my cutting tool at low setting to get the hatch open. Inside, on a carbon fiber cradle that had automatically deployed on impact, was the smallest living thing I had ever seen. She was Korvath. Even I could tell that much. Scaled skin in deep charcoal gray, still faintly lit from within by the ember glow that all Korvath hatchlings carry in their early months. Her wings were folded tight against her body, the membrane along the left one torn and dark at the edges. She was burned in 3 places along her side, where heat had pushed through the pod's insulation. Her eyes were closed, her breathing was shallow and slow, the tiny rise and fall of her chest barely visible. She fit in both my hands with room to spare. I stood there for what felt like a long time. The logical course of action, Drea said through my helmet, is to report the find to compact authorities, submit coordinates, await a retrieval team, and collect the standard biological find fee, which I estimate at roughly 400 credits. How long would retrieval take? Given current compact response queues in this sector, approximately 40 to 60 hours. I looked at the hatchling. I looked at her breathing, which was already too slow and too shallow. I looked at the burned edges of her wing. She won't last 40 hours. No, Drea agreed. She will not. I picked her up carefully, both hands cupped beneath her, and carried her back to the ship. I told myself it was temporary. Drea recorded that statement. She told me she was doing so. I told her to mind her own business. She said her business was, by definition, my business. I didn't have a good answer for that. The first 6 hours were the hardest. Korvath hatchlings are thermal creatures. They need heat the way humans need air. Not as a comfort, but as a biological requirement. The ship's ambient temperature was set for human comfort, which was far too cold for a creature who had been designed, over millions of years of evolution, to be born near the mouth of a volcano. I raided my spare parts locker and built a cradle from salvaged thermal coils, rerouting heat from the engine cooling system to maintain a stable temperature around her small body. I burned my left hand twice getting the calibration right. I got it right on the 3rd try. Feeding was the next problem. I had exactly 0 knowledge of what Korvath hatchlings ate, and the compact's public database had exactly 4 pages on Korvath biology, all of them vague and clearly written by someone who had never actually been near a Korvath. I searched for 3 hours. Then I improvised. Korvath were fire-blooded, mineral-heavy metabolisms. I started with sulfur compounds from my chemical stores, dissolved in trace metal solution, warmed to well above what any human could safely touch. I offered it with a cleaned fuel injector tube, repurposed as a narrow dropper. She took it. Slowly. Barely. But she took it. She did not cry once. Not when I moved her. Not when I cleaned her burns. Not when I worked on her wing, which I could do nothing real for except keep it clean and warm and leave it alone. She was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like patience. Like she was simply waiting to see what happened next. I started calling her Ember. It felt accurate. It felt like the right word for something small that was still burning against all reasonable expectation. On the second day, the broadcast started. Every compact channel, every frequency, every registered communication band in the sector lit up at the same time. The Korvath Queen had issued a blood search declaration, the most serious form of alert in Korvath legal tradition. Her convoy had been ambushed by separatist faction ships. Most of the diplomatic crew had been recovered. The Queen's daughter, the sole heir of the Korvath bloodline, was missing. No remains had been found. The Queen had given the compact 30 cycles to produce her daughter, or face consequences that the broadcast carefully declined to specify, but that everyone listening clearly understood. I sat in my pilot seat and listened to the whole broadcast twice. Then, I turned around and looked at the thermal cradle behind the co-pilot station. Ember's ember glow was a little stronger today. She had opened her eyes once that morning and looked at me for a few seconds before closing them again. Her left wing was still folded. She had eaten 3 times. "Well," I said. "Indeed," said Drea. "I did not call it in. I want to be clear that I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time, sitting in that pilot seat with the broadcast still running in the background. But I knew what calling it in meant. It meant compact bureaucracy. It meant forms and verifications, and interspecies protocols, and the whole machinery of political caution moving at its usual speed, which was the speed of something that had never been in a hurry in its entire institutional life. It meant Ember spending another 40 hours in a shipping container somewhere, transferred between stations, logged and relabeled and processed. She was not a package. She was getting stronger. I was not going to hand her to a filing system. I kept flying my salvage routes. I kept feeding her. I kept adjusting the thermal coils. I told myself I would figure out the next step when she was stable enough to survive it. On the 3rd day, the warships came. 3 Korvath cruisers swept the debris field in formation. They hailed me on standard frequency, routine, almost bored in tone. A human salvager in a restricted zone was not interesting to them. I was the lowest possible priority in the sector. That was useful. Officer Harvick boarded with 2 soldiers. He was tall even by Korvath standards, amber-plated, with the particular expression of someone who found most things beneath their attention and had organized their life accordingly. He looked at my ship the way you look at something you stepped on by accident. He asked his questions. Found anything unusual? Biosignatures? Korvath materials? Anything inconsistent with standard salvage? I said, just wreckage. I had hidden Ember in the thermal regulation shaft 3 minutes before they docked. The shaft ran behind a service panel in the cargo hold. It was warm there, warmer than the rest of the ship by design, because of the engine routing I had done for her cradle. Her heat signature was buried inside the ship's own thermal output. I had not planned that. It had happened because I built her cradle in a hurry, with whatever I had, and the result, accidentally, was a near-perfect heat mask. The 2 soldiers walked through the cargo hold. One of them passed within 2 meters of the panel. Ember, behind it, made no sound. Not a breath louder than necessary. Not a movement. I have thought about that moment many times since. I do not have an explanation for it. I only know what happened. Harvick left. His contempt was thorough and impersonal, the kind that is not directed at you specifically, but at the entire category of thing you belong to. I had met it before. It did not bother me. What mattered was that he was gone. Drea played back my statement from day one. It's temporary. I ignored her with dignity. Ember opened her eyes again that evening and kept them open for nearly an hour. She watched me while I worked on the coil calibration. I watched her back, occasionally, when I thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. There was something in those eyes that was not infant, and was not entirely young either. It was the look of something that was still deciding whether the world was worth the effort of existing in. I wanted her to decide yes. I kept the heat steady. I kept the sulfur solution warm. I talked to her sometimes. About nothing. About the salvage routes. About the particular ugliness of Sector 7 Gamma. About how Drea had opinions about everything, and was wrong about most of them. Drea, for the record, disputed this characterization. On the 5th day, I made my decision. I was not going to hand Ember to the Compact. I was not going to wait for the right political moment. I was going to fly directly to the Korvath command fleet, unarmed and without appointment, and return her myself. I sent one message ahead, short and plain. I have what you are looking for. I am coming in unarmed. Do not fire until you have seen what I am carrying. Drea told me the statistical probability of surviving this approach was not something she was comfortable stating aloud. I flew toward the fleet anyway. They surrounded me with 12 warships before I crossed the outer boundary. Tractor beams locked on before I had a chance to brake. They pulled me into the flagship bay without a word. Harvick was there. His expression, when the airlock opened and he saw me step out, went through 3 different things in 2 seconds. Confusion was last. I was holding Ember in both arms, wrapped in the thermal blanket I had made for her from insulation foam and reflective salvage sheet. She was awake. She was looking around the bay with those patient, ancient eyes. The Queen came down herself. I had seen images of Vareth Sul. Images did not prepare you. She was enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, not just in size but in the sense that they have been there longer than anything around them and intend to remain. She moved with the particular slowness of something that has never needed to hurry, because hurrying is for things that can be outrun. The entire bay went silent when she entered. Soldiers who had been tense went still. Harvick stood straighter without appearing to notice he was doing it. I walked across the bay toward her. My boots on the deck were the only sound. I held Ember out. I said, "She is going to need more sulfur compound than I had available. Her left wing membrane is healing, but needs proper medical attention. She ate 3 times today. She did not cry once the whole time she was with me." The Queen looked at her daughter. She reached out with hands that were larger than my entire torso and took her with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from something so large. Ember made a sound then, the first sound I had ever heard from her, a small low note, like a coal settling in a fire. The Queen closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she looked at me. It was the kind of look that takes your full measure without asking your permission. I stood still and let it happen. After a long moment she said, "You are a salvager." I said, "I found her in the wreckage. She was still warm, that is all." There was a pause in which I became aware of how many weapons were in the room, and how easily any one of them could solve the problem of me. Then the Queen spoke a single word in Korvath, that Drea later translated as something between absolution and gift, the way a language uses one word when 2 ideas have always lived in the same place. What followed was loud and political, and above my pay grade in every possible way. The Compact convened emergency sessions. Species delegations argued about protocol. Harvick argued for consequences and was overruled publicly, which I was told was unprecedented. The Queen granted me a debt mark, a permanent legal binding under Korvath blood law. No Korvath could harm me. No Korvath port could turn my ship away. I was marked, in the oldest tradition they had, as blood friend of the royal line. I did not fully understand what that meant until later, when doors in ports across 6 systems opened for me without question, when Korvath traders nodded as I passed and said nothing, and needed to say nothing. When Harvick, boarding his cruiser as I prepared to leave the flagship, stopped for one moment, and looked back, and gave me a single nod that contained, I thought, an entire argument he had decided to stop having. I flew back to my salvage routes. The thermal cradle was empty. I had cleaned it and stored it in the cargo hold, because I did not know what else to do with it. Drea asked me, somewhere in the quiet of the 3rd day back at work, whether I had known who Ember was when I first picked her up. I said no. I said it did not matter. Drea said, it mattered to her. I did not answer. I pulled up the chart for the next debris field, checked my oxygen stores, and set a course. Somewhere out there in all that broken dark, there was likely something else that was still warm. There was probably something that had survived what it was not supposed to survive, and was waiting in the wreckage without making a sound, patient and enduring, simply waiting to see what happened next. That was the job. It had always been the job. I went to find it,